you actually have sarcoid? Yeah, that's fantastic. I think, and this is the third time that Seven Center has been involved in this type of activity. We did this a couple of years ago, and we were absolutely floored by our response. About 130 people from all over the eastern seaboard. And so we've recognized that this is a problem, a disease, for which we all hunger for more knowledge and understanding. And so I think our goal today is to make sure that you get your questions answered. So one of the things that I recommended we do when we sent out the pre-application material was to give you an opportunity to write down some key questions or some key goals that you have in attending this conference. And so I sort of summarized it very briefly. There was questions about.
Yeah, exactly.
Way back. Okay. So someone wanted to know more about research in neurosarcoidosis, and the person who asked that question will make sure that we talk a lot about that. Dr. Tavy is one of our speakers. She's a really renowned neurologist who has studied neurosarcoid. We've had questions about multi-system sarcoidosis, and certainly, hopefully, over the next few hours, you'll get a good sense of what that means. New discoveries and treatments. Hopefully, we'll get all of those questions answered, and of course, Dr. Bonham's discussions, and along with our group discussions. What are the lung manifestations? Dr. Cass is going to be speaking right after me. Hereditary factors, we'll all sort of touch on that, and I'll touch a little bit on that when I get a chance to talk. And then monitoring sarcoidosis disease activity and treatment. And I'm sure there are many other questions that you might have that did not appear in this card that we want you to feel free to ask. Make sure when you leave this conference that all your questions are answered to us, because that's really the goal of this happening. So what I'm going to try to do today is to kind of frame our discussion about sarcoidosis. Now, unfortunately, our medical field is organized into silos, and each silo is an organ system, one organ system. And so when we talk about a disease affecting many organ systems, we often do so with blinders on. So the cardiologist will talk about its manifestations, the skin doctors will talk about their manifestations, the lung doctors will talk about their manifestations. And it's kind of hard to get the global picture of what it is we're talking about. So I'm going to talk about sarcoidosis as a disease. I'm going to give you a historical context, which I always found quite interesting when I did my own research on this many years ago. Some of the first descriptions of sarcoidosis, most of which were in Europe, in fact, most of which were in Scandinavia. And it was probably one of the reasons why when you type in who gets sarcoidosis, you see Scandinavians are the group that seems to be in it, excessively represented. It was probably because they discovered the disease in Scandinavia mostly, although the British, I think, have some role in that. We'll talk about that in just a moment. I'm going to talk a little bit about current understanding of sarcoidosis epidemiology. The term epidemiology, of course, means the study of the incidence and prevalence of the disease. And this is going to be a very brief discussion because, in truth, we have very little good data. In fact, we have no good data about the epidemiology. We all believe that it's grossly underestimated. It's a tremendously important problem that we really don't have a good handle on, even after many, many years of talking about this aspect of the disease. And then I'll give you a perspective of how I think about the natural history of sarcoidosis. By natural history, I mean, what actually happens to people when they get this disease? What can you expect, and how do we think about it? Because how we think about it often dictates what treatment approaches we're going to take to keep you well. And I'll warn you ahead of time, there are many great sarcoidosis centers, but no two centers behave the same way or recommend the same thing. Have you discovered that already? Has anyone discovered that? Okay, one or two, good. It's because we learn based on our own experiences with patients, what works and what doesn't work. And we're struggling now to come up with some unified guidelines, but the disease is so variable from one person to the next that It's going to take some time before we all come to agreement as to what the universal guideline should be. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of a historical perspective. Now, I'm going to take you back to around 1800s, the late 1800s. You have to think of the world back then. Medicine didn't have all of the invasive tools we use to diagnose disease. And so I think the king of the hill of medicine back in the 1800s were dermatologists. Because most diseases back then had some cutaneous manifestations, and so dermatologists kind of led the field. And there's one dermatologist by the name of Jonathan Hutchinson, who's a British dermatologist. Hutchinson is credited with describing the first case of sarcoidosis, although he was never really given full credit for that until much, much later, because unfortunately Hutchinson was not very good at naming diseases. So the first case he described, he gave the name livid papillary psoriasis. That's a killer of a name, and no one's going to ever remember that. But he also called it Mortimer's malady. And the reason why he called it Mortimer's malady is that he had a patient by the name of Mortimer who was a worker at the wharf who developed sarcoidosis later in her life. And the disease had very, very unusual cutaneous manifestations. She had large lumps in her face that were violaceous, so some of them had a scaly look. And it didn't look like any of the diseases that were prevalent at the time, mostly lupus and tuberculosis. And so he recognized almost immediately that he had some unusual new disease he was dealing with. And it's interesting, he went to his society. Mortimer was part of this very elite clinic in Britain called the Black Fair Skin Clinic. Skin clinics were really clinics where people went for healthcare problems, usually manifested by skin diseases, probably the most important of which were skin-related changes in tuberculosis and, of course, syphilis, which was a big problem back then. Wharton was a syphilologist, as the saying was back then. But anyway, he recognized this was not any of those diseases, and so he gave it this name, livid papillary psoriasis, but it was also for Morton's malady. And the drawing I have here is what this patient must have looked like. Of course, this is an era that predates photography. But almost at the same time this was happening, there was a fellow by the name of Carl Beck. He was a dermatologist in, I think Carl Beck was in Norway. He was a Norwegian dermatologist. And of course, he was also director of this large clinic that focused on primarily venereal diseases. And Carl Beck also had patients that had these skin manifestations, but he thought that they looked like skin cancers, although they didn't behave like skin cancers. They were much more benign, and so he gave it the term sarcoid. And Beck's sarcoid, in fact, has been the term used to describe the disease for many years because it's a little bit more catchy term than I think livid papillary psoriasis. So I think you've all heard of the term Beck's sarcoid. It's because Carl Beck gave it a much better name. And it's amazing how close in time these were, because these physicians were in communication with each other at various conferences. So there was a little bit of a competition going on between Beck and Hutchinson. But Beck eventually won out as being the person in whom we associate more closely with this disease. Beck also trained another investigator, his nephew, Caesar Beck. And Caesar Beck in 1899, so we're still in the 1800s, was credited with making up important observations about what this disease actually looks like under a microscope. So Caesar, and so there are a lot of evolutions occurring in medicine at this time, one of which was to look at diseases under a microscope. So, Koch was doing this for tuberculosis. And people were becoming a little bit more scientific in their thinking. We're moving out of the age of medicine where everyone was being bled by leeches, and there was a little bit more of a scientific approach. And so Caesar Beck actually was credited with giving us some of the early descriptions of sarcoidosis being this granulomatous disease. And he even began to recognize that there were other organs involved, because many of these patients would die and get autopsies and they would discover these typical sarcoid lesions in other organ systems. But I'd like to mention one other person in the sarcoid discussion of history, because Carl Röntgen was the inventor of the X-ray, which occurred right around the same time, around 1895, and the X-ray machine sort of revolutionized the practice of medicine at that time in history. Well, why do I say that? Well, there were two big things that were happening, one of which, of course, was the venereal disease area, syphilis, etc. But the other big thing in medicine during that time was tuberculosis. In the late 1800s, tuberculosis was a great scourge of Europe and the New Americas, particularly as urban centers developed. And tuberculosis, the diagnosis and treatment of tuberculosis sort of evolved rapidly around the turn of the century with the discovery that it's actually caused by a bacterium, but also with the discovery of the X-ray machine, which allowed for physicians to make the diagnosis of tuberculosis based on chest X-ray. It also revolutionized the diagnosis of sarcoidosis, because we learned with the invention of the chest X-ray that sarcoidosis, most patients will have X-ray abnormalities. It's probably part of the movement of this disease from the hands of the dermatologist primarily to that of lung specialists. Another figure that I'll mention very briefly is Schaumann. Schaumann was a Swedish dermatologist who was credited with really providing the most comprehensive understanding of what this disease represents that probably is very relevant to how we think of it today. Schaumann really thought that, it does have skin manifestations. He's learned over the years that there are other organs that can be involved in it. And he provided in one writing that was first looked at in 1914, but didn't get published until 1936. And I always like to tell my fellows, remember, you really have to be tenacious. 20 years is a bit long. But anyway, he's credited with really providing sort of the clearest view of what this disease actually represents. And so the point I'm making is that this disease really has a very interesting evolutionary history that began as a skin disease and has slowly moved on to be recognized as a disease that involves multiple organ systems. I'll just mention a few other names because you may hear these names. Hereford. Has anyone ever heard of Hereford before? I know I have one patient. She may not be here. Okay, good. Hereford was a fellow that described this entity called uveal parotid fever. It's interesting, Hereford thought it was actually a manifestation of mumps, because you get big cheeks because of the involvement of the salivary glands. And that was not too long after he described it, attributed to sarcoidosis. In 1941, there was a fellow by the name of Klein. Has anyone heard of the Klein-Siltzbach test? Good, we're moving far away from that. That's good. Gavine was an interesting guy. He actually took some sarcoid tissues, ground it up, and injected it into people, and was able to show that when you do that, you can elicit a skin reaction in people who have sarcoid, but if they didn't have sarcoid, they wouldn't get that reaction. Another fellow, Siltzbach, purified the entity better. We could never do that today, unfortunately. Grind up some sarcoid tissue and inject it. But back then, it was probably thought to be a useful test in distinguishing sarcoidosis patients from, say, tuberculosis and other diseases that can look like sarcoid. And it was popularized in the 40s and became a very, very commonly employed test. In 1946, Lofgren, has anyone heard of Lofgrens? Good. In fact, we've heard about Lofgrens. Our speaker this morning talked about Lofgrens. I only mention this because it's a common name. Sven Lofgren described this manifestation of sarcoidosis where patients would get these painful, tender nodules in their skin, usually the arms and the legs. And it would be associated with lots of arthritis, fever, sometimes lots of systemic symptoms. The illness could last sometimes for months. And if you get a chest X-ray, they often have chest X-ray abnormalities that included swollen lymph nodes in the center of the chest. So it was a very, very clear syndrome. Came in like a lion, went out as a lamb. We call it now acute sarcoidosis. And we used to think, and we still do today, that in most cases it implies a relatively benign clinical course of disease. Well, Paul just told you that's not true because he didn't have a benign clinical course of disease. And I think while it may be true that the clinical course of the disease may be benign for patients in terms of their lung manifestations, we have lots of patients that go on later to develop other manifestations of sarcoid. And so it's not as benign perhaps as we once thought. And in fact, I'll show just a couple of pictures. I'm not going to steal the thunder of our radiologists, but just to give your eyes a bit of a rest, to show you something different. This is what Lofgren's looks like in a patient that has the cutaneous lesions on her legs. What's interesting about Lofgren's, and what made him very clever, is that the lesions, the Erythema Nodosum, which is a skin rash, if you biopsy them, you don't actually see sarcoidosis in the biopsy. This is actually an inflammation involving blood vessels that occurs in the setting of sarcoidosis, but you can see it in other settings as well. So it's not actually a sarcoidosis skin involvement, but they get lots of arthritis, they get visual problems, and they have this chest x-ray that shows, we call it a stage 1 radiograph, where it shows the swollen lymph nodes. And Dr. Cass would make you much more experts in chest x-rays in just a moment. And the prognosis generally is good, although there are patients who can go on to develop other manifestations. This is what it would look like in repeated arms as well. So important milestones occurred that I think has sort of led us to the current understanding of sarcoidosis. But I wanted to point out a few interesting elements in the sarcoidosis history, because some of these things are coming back. So an interesting story, when we came to understand sarcoidosis, we came to understand it as a disease of inflammation. And most of the symptoms that patients would describe in organ systems were related to inflammation. And so an interesting tidbit in history is that between 1948 and 1949, there were a couple of scientists were studying this hormone called ACTH. It's a hormone that's secreted by the brain that helps to control the adrenal glands. And one of them won a Nobel Prize actually for describing this, what we call a neurotransmitter. It's secreted by the brain, but it actually helps to stimulate the production of cortisol by these glands. And around the time this hormone was discovered, it was recognized that cortisol is a pretty good anti-inflammatory drug. And so for a few years, the treatment of inflammatory diseases became providing this hormone, this ACTH, which at that time was isolated from the pituitary glands of cows. They grind up cow pituitary, squeeze it out, I guess, in some blender, and mix it up and inject it into people. And it was used as an anti-inflammatory therapy, mostly initially for arthritis, but eventually for a lot of inflammatory diseases, that included sarcoidosis. Does anyone recognize that drug? Has anyone tried that drug? Because it's now available today, and it's currently about to start a clinical trial. It's called Actar. I'll tell you that story sometime. But the reason why this drug had a very short lifespan in sarcoidosis management was the discovery of the ability to make cortisol directly, the ability to make steroids directly. And the biochemists who found a way to make steroids actually won a Nobel Prize as well. But when steroids were made, it basically took Actar out of the equation, and we started using corticosteroids to treat inflammatory diseases like sarcoid, probably beginning as early as 1951. Another important milestone is how many of you have actually had bronchoscopies to diagnose? Good. The first bronchoscopies employed to diagnose sarcoidosis was in 1975. It was a major breakthrough because guess how we diagnosed sarcoid before bronchoscopy? Who would guess? It's not skin. We used to do liver biopsies at the bedside. Stick a needle in it. I've done many of those in my early years in training at Emory, not looking for sarcoid, but poking a big needle on the side of into the liver, pulling it out and sucking out some liver cells. The liver was the target organ for sarcoid diagnosis when there were no other manifestations. Bronchoscopy, believe me. And with bronchoscopy, and I just mentioned this, it was followed by the use of that tool really to wash out the airways of patients with sarcoid as a research tool that helped us to understand this disease much better. And a lot of our treatments, in fact, today are based on information that we got when we go down and wash out some lung cells and collect proteins and cells to understand what actually happens in this disease process. And there have been a lot of really interesting drugs that have been developed, and they're ongoing development today, largely because of these earlier studies. Now, if my talk has had this European focus, it's because much of this stuff was actually in Europe. What about the United States? What's going on in our country? Well, you know, medicine in the United States really saw its biggest evolution under the leadership of very prominent physicians at Johns Hopkins called Osler. And he wrote the textbooks of medicine that were largely used to train American physicians at the turn of the century. Still a prominent figure in medicine many years after his death. But in the early decades, sarcoidosis was not even mentioned in American textbooks during the turn of the century. In fact, the first description of a case of sarcoidosis was that of a 14-year-old that was admitted to Johns Hopkins Hospital somewhere around 1930, almost 40 years or 50 years after the Europeans recognized this disease. And it wasn't really until 1937 that a significant publication describing sarcoidosis even appeared in America. So we're kind of we've always been behind the ball in this disease. But we did eventually describe it, and what I have here is a classic medical description that you're likely to encounter online if you try to seek an answer to the question, what is sarcoidosis? And so what is it? Well, it's a multi-system granulomatous disease of unknown etiology which frequently affects intrathoracic organs and which is associated with characteristic abnormalities of cellular and immune system responses. That really adds a lot of clarity, doesn't it? And you know, it's interesting because I think the fogginess surrounding that definition largely reflects the fogginess in our understanding of this disease as physicians. Because in fact, what we're really saying is that when we say granulomatous disease, I'm going to describe to you what we mean by that in just a moment. But granulomas are scars, and patients with sarcoidosis develop these inflammation and scars in multiple systems, multiple organs in the body. We don't know why they develop them. It commonly can affect organs within the chest, so they get lymph node involvement and lung involvement in almost all cases, but not all cases. And there are abnormalities which we can identify when we look at how their immune system is turned on. That's basically what it means. So what is this granuloma? How does it form? Well, you know, I like to think of granulomatous inflammation. In fact, what granulomatous inflammation is it's an arm of our immune system. Our immune system is designed to protect us against things that enter our body. My patients have heard me say this many times. So we all have the ability to form granulomas. Granulomatous inflammation is a normal immune response to certain organisms that gain access to our bodies. These organisms can be foreign bodies, they can be tuberculosis, they can be fungal infections, they can be some viruses. And when these things enter our body, our immune system reacts to them. And our immune system is activated, it sends out these cells that first bind to this foreign particle so they can identify any characteristics that might help the immune system to fight it. And so we call that the early mediator-releasing activation phase. And these cells, if you're interested in them, they're macrophages and T cells, which are immune cells of the immune system. But what happens when this binding occurs to this unknown particle is that it stimulates a complex immune response that leads to the body sending all of these cells to that area where this organism or this particle has entered the body, and it sequesters that particle in place, so it gives it time for the body to go in and kill it later. And that sequestration of all these cells is what we call a granuloma. And so granulomatous response is actually a normal part of the immune response. What makes it sarcoidosis is when we don't know what that antigen is. We can't identify what that antigen is. When the antigen is tuberculosis, tuberculous, we call it tuberculosis. When it's a fungal, we call it a fungal infection. But in sarcoidosis, we don't know what that antigen is. We can't identify it. So this immune system has been turned on, but without any clear antigen. And the thinking is that if whatever this antigen is, if the immune system takes care of it, the disease becomes quiescent. If the antigen persists, then your disease persists, and you end up with chronic disease. And that's kind of how we think of it. And so what does it look like? Well, if I take a granuloma and put it under a microscope, this is a characteristic appearance of a granuloma. And the intent here is not to make you all histologists, but you can appreciate that there's this sort of a circular nodular-like lesion. In the center of it is a large cell we call a macrophage. These are the cells that actually recognize the antigen. And this is a sarcoid granuloma because when we stain this and look for organisms, we don't see any. And so sarcoidosis, to an extent, is a disease of exclusion because you have to make sure that there's no specific organism precipitating this response before you can make that diagnosis. You know, we believe now that, we say that we define the disease in terms of the absence of this antigen, but you know, we've always thought there must be something that started this process. And probably the last 75 years or so has been spent trying to figure out what triggers this type of immune response in patients with sarcoid. And so we've looked for viruses, we've looked for unusual bacteria, Borrelia, we've looked for mycoplasma, mycobacterial disease, because it looks so similar to tuberculosis. We've looked for inorganic dust like beryllium. We've looked at pine tree pollen. I'm sure you've encountered all of these things when you go online and look for causes for sarcoidosis. And in fact, none of those things have bore out. None of these things have been identified as true causes for this disease. And in fact, our thinking is evolving to a point now where we're coming to believe that in fact there probably isn't any one antigen that causes this disease. In fact, it may be one of those complex interactions between the human's genetic makeup and the environment that we live in that somehow creates the stage for which people develop this disease. And there's some evidence, observational evidence, that supports that theory. You know, we recognize, for example, that sometimes we can see sarcoidosis running within families. You know, not necessarily siblings, but certainly one of the members of the family might be affected by it. So there may be either a shared genetic influence plus a shared environment. The only true genetic link that I was able to identify, and is often quoted, has been an interesting observation made in Germany around 1923. These identical twins, identical of course means that they have identical genetic makeups, were separated at birth and then found later in their adulthoods, raised in entirely different environments. Both of those twins developed sarcoidosis. It's been probably the most compelling argument that there must be a genetic cause. Well, we've looked and we've concluded that there's no one gene. In fact, it probably is a genetic makeup. It's probably a constellation of genes, perhaps, that are important in the development of this disease. There is certainly some slight increase in prevalence in family members. Those of you that have sarcoidosis, how many of you have a family member that also has sarcoidosis? So not very many, right? Not very many. And so there may be some genetic link to that. I have to move along. Am I running out of time?
No, you're doing fine.
I'm doing fine. Yell at me or say something to give me a I doubt. But we think that this is a complicated disease that involves both some sort of environmental interaction and then how your immune system reacts to it. It's a multi-system disease, but not all systems, we believe, are affected to the same degree. So the reason why lung doctors are so often involved is not only because we participate in the diagnosis, is because the lung and the organ systems within the chest are very commonly involved in sarcoidosis. Probably close to 90% of patients will have some evidence of disease in the lungs and in the lymph nodes. Liver disease, probably around 60%. And these numbers are not precise, I should warn you, because there really has not been careful epidemiological studies. But you can see it in the eyes, probably at around 20 to 25%, which is one of the reasons why we encourage eye exams in all newly diagnosed sarcoidosis. What I found interesting is that when this particular study cited, the skin was only involved in around maybe 20% of patients, even though at the turn of the century when it was first described, it was a skin disease. And dermatologists made the greatest contributions in this disease. We now recognize that probably 70% of the folks that had sarcoidosis were not diagnosed if you had based entirely on whether they developed skin manifestations. Spleen was involved around 10%. What's interesting is that the heart, we don't really know how common heart disease develops in sarcoidosis patients. It was once thought to be 5%. The numbers are creeping up now to 30%. It may even be greater than that. It's only been recently that we had a useful test to detect cardiac sarcoidosis. And I know there are a handful of folks in this room here that have cardiac manifestations. You know, my patients. But yeah, it's, you probably are learning that cardiac sarcoid is probably one of the greatest areas in this disease that we're still learning a great deal about. We get better tools and we have much better medicines to manage it, but its epidemiology is still poorly understood. I'll say this, you know, I've been doing this for 30 years or so. But early on, I would say half the patients that I saw with cardiac sarcoid, they came to me after they were resuscitated after an episode of sudden death. Half. Right? So the half that I didn't see probably didn't make it. So cardiac sarcoid, one of the reasons why it's so important is that it can be a devastating disease. I know those that have cardiac sarcoid, I'm preaching to the choir because you've all had your experiences with this disease. But it's an important disease, and Dr. Mathur is going to tell us a lot more about it. One other final point, it's not really the final slide, but a final point I want to make is how we think about this disease in our center. You know, so when a patient is diagnosed with sarcoid, the first question that's often asked us is, so what's going to happen? You know, what does this mean? And what I like to do in my mind is to think about this disease as being part of 3 different sort of clinical courses. Right? So most patients, thank goodness, will have a disease that goes into spontaneous remission. So by spontaneous remission, I mean there's no evidence of active sarcoid inflammation, there's no need for medical therapy. Oftentimes these patients were discovered to have sarcoid quite by accident. They were having a routine test, and someone saw some swollen lymph nodes, and then the journey begins. How many folks had that experience? Wow, great. You know, back when we used to do chest x-rays as part of routine employment physicals, we got so many sarcoid diagnoses because some healthy person would get a chest x-ray and see swollen glands and get this big workup. And so we diagnosed a lot more back then. We don't see it. We don't do as many routine chest x-rays today. But that's a common story. And then there's the patient that can have, or the clinical course where you're always active. We call it chronic active sarcoid, where you're having active inflammation, you're having lots of symptoms, there's evidence of loss of organ function. We call that chronic active disease. You have to be put on therapy. Therapy goes away, you get more symptoms, you get put back on therapy. And these are patients that need to be on treatment continuously for an extended period of time because their disease is always active. That's another clinical pattern. And then the third clinical pattern, this is one which I'm promoting, which I'm not sure is getting any traction, is what I like to call relapsing remitting disease. And this is a tough one because these are patients, this is a clinical course where you're fine most of the time, but every once in a while you'll get a flare, someone will call it pneumonia, flu, or whatever. You get better, you get put on antibiotics, steroids, you get better, do well for months or even years, get another flare. You have this sort of pattern of disease where you flare, remit, flare, remit. The problem is that when you remit, you have scar tissue that you didn't have before, so you lose a little bit of organ function, you flare again, you go into remission, lose a little bit more organ function, and over a period of years, you're not where you were when you started. But you don't have active symptoms right now, so you go to the doctor and he says, I don't think you really need to be treated because you're not active now. Does anyone have that sort of experience? Wow. Where's my phone? You see that? I gotta tell Mark Justin. It really is a real thing.
I think it is catching on.
It is catching on? Okay, good. This is so important because it's so important because the patients who have relapsing remitting disease are the folks that sneak down the road and you see them 5 or 6 years later and they've lost organ function. When we look at patients who get lung transplants, these are the folks that have relapsing remitting disease and end up with lung transplants. And it's a shame, it's frustrating because we can can stop the inflammation of sarcoidosis, right? Yes, steroids, we can stop it. But when you have relapsing remitting disease, you're not going to take 60 milligrams of prednisone if you're feeling well. I mean, crazy. Gain 300 pounds, you get sick from prednisone. So the approach to relapsing remitting disease is really to give therapy to prevent relapses, not necessarily to treat active disease, but to prevent relapses. And that's a new concept because we are just now getting those types of drugs. It's not prednisone, right? It's, someone want to tell me? Drugs like methyltrexate, those types of drugs, right? Enough immunosuppression to suppress relapse, but not so much it makes you sick like prednisone. Well, I'm preaching to the choir, I can tell. So how important is it? Well, I said many times, we've all said this, it's not a common disease. It's estimated to be around 10 per 100,000 white population, 35 in the black population. It's thought to be about 40,000 Americans actively suffering from the disease. I did my own math, and I'm not very good at math. That's why I became a doctor. But if you estimate the number of new cases per year, it's around 22,500 in the white population in America, and around 12,500 in the black population in America. And I did that calculation based on black Americans being around 12% of the population, and the population being around 300 million. So the point I like to make is that while it is disproportionate among the black population in America, most Americans who have sarcoidosis are white Americans, right? Just sheer numbers. And I think that's an important observation.
I think it's the worst.
Am I getting too close?
We're about time to move on.
Okay, good.
Any closing?
So I'm closing this with this. It's a global disease. And the last point I want to make is that people are dying more now than they were before. Despite the treatments, the last epidemiological studies showed that in fact the prevalence of this disease, or the prevalence of death from this disease is going down. We are failing because more people are dying from sarcoidosis than they have before. So this is the most compelling reason why we need to do disease-modifying therapies. We need more research. And so with that, last slide, George Bush. Has anyone seen this proclamation? George W. Bush made a presidential proclamation called 6332 that named August 15th National Sarcoidosis. HW, yeah, not junior, senior. H.W. Bush, the National Sarcoidosis Awareness Day. And you can get this online. It's a very nice proclamation that tried to bring awareness of this disease, but it didn't succeed, obviously, because none of you have heard of that. That's my conclusions. I hope that you find that this conference answers all the questions that you come with this sarcoidosis. I'm sorry I went over a bit, but with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. I think a perfect segue into our next speaker, who's going to speak about lung manifestations. Thank you. This presentation here.